My name is Nikita and I'll be hosting the session today. For those of you who are new to the IRSS community, I'll take a quick moment to introduce ourselves. So ILSS, or India Leaders for Social Sector, is a learning and leadership development organization for the social sector. And we started about 2 years back with our flagship leadership program, which is designed to empower senior executives from corporates and other sectors to make an informed and meaningful transition into the development sector. So it's our way of offering a bridge into a second career in the social impact space. And we run this as a 9-day residential course, the next edition of which is coming very soon, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. ILSS Online, which you're currently attending, is our latest offering, wherein we've had academics, policymakers, sector leaders, and practitioners come in and talk about their work, especially in the COVID context, but also beyond. And we soon hope to launch our capacity building programs for social sector professionals, starting with a fundraising professional development program. So please do look out for that. If you enjoyed today's session, I'd encourage you to look at our website to find more details about our 9-day flagship leadership program. We're hosting the next edition of it in August this year. Applications are currently open and are being reviewed on a rolling basis. The last date is July 15th, 2020. And if you have any questions at all and would like to talk to us more about this program, we'll be very happy to speak with you about it. So with that, I'll come back to today's session. We have with us Dr. Kenwyn Smith, who's a professor at UPenn. He teaches organizational behavior and is also the director of UPenn's master's program in nonprofit leadership. Dr. Smith teaches leadership, intergroup dynamics, OB, change management in 3 of Penn's schools. And his research spans across multiple areas, from prisons and schools to businesses, healthcare institutions, social enterprises. And he's also done today what we will focus on to understand and decode a few aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic is will draw on his work on HIV-AIDS. So Kenwyn, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for making time. We're really grateful. I'll hand over to you to take on the session.
So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you. I'd like to begin with quoting the words of Victor Hugo. Be like the bird that pauses in its flight a while on boughs too slight, feels them give way beneath her, and yet sings, knowing that she hath wings. Be like the bird that pausing in her flight a while on boughs too slight, feels them give way beneath her, and yet sings, knowing that she hath wings. I think the situation the whole world is in at the moment is an invitation to pause and take stock. It's clearly a crisis that will be with us for a sustained period. And one of the features of this particular crisis is that it is universal. Many of the other pandemics that humanity's experienced is they've been geographically sequestered at different times. But this is one that has the whole world simultaneously focused upon the same issue. Now, I must say that this is a very painful time for us all, but it isn't a space that we haven't been in before. Humanity's been here many, many times previously. Just in my own lifetime, for example, as a child, polio is still with us. TB was still with us as a pandemic into the 1970s. Malaria was as well. Then we came full smack into the HIV crisis of the 80s, 90s, well into the early 2000s. We've had SARS, we've had H1N1. There have been so many pandemics, and it would be easy to believe that these are episodic events that will someday vanish, but they have been with humanity for all time. And they have often been transition occasions in our lives. Some transitions have been problematic, and others have been really enhancing in a way. In the early 1900s, probably the most glaring one was the avian flu, which led to the death of somewhere between 30 to 50 million people. We had another virus called Nazism. It was not a biological virus, but certainly was a psychological virus that led to World War II, and that created the deaths of so many millions and millions and millions of people. So we shouldn't pretend that this is a complete unique moment. There are plenty of lessons from the past that are worth paying attention to. I'm choosing today to share with you the experience of dealing with HIV. This happened in my lifetime, in my midlife. I was in around about my 40s when HIV in the city of Philadelphia became really visible to us all. The thing about HIV was, just like COVID, we had zero knowledge of what this virus was. We didn't know how it was communicated. We didn't know whether it was coming through the air conditioning or the heating ducts. We didn't know whether walking down the street, on the opposite side of the street, if a person had HIV, whether it would have a contagious effect even wandering across the street. And so the tendency to move to a high level of prejudicial behavior was really very, very high. The other thing that was amazing about it is that the HIV virus had been with us for approximately 10 years before we even knew it existed. It had been latent, and it wasn't until people began to become ill with full-blown AIDS did we realize that HIV even existed. And then when we did the early tests to try to understand how many people had it, the earliest test in Philadelphia alone, there was 36,000 people. And by then we'd begin to appreciate that probably had a 10-year incubating people. And that meant that if every year, we were probably going to lose about 4,000 people in just this one city. This was a stunningly painful psychological event in the same way as the COVID is. The anxiety was basically through the roof. I can remember the very first times I began to see on the streets of Philadelphia homeless people who clearly had AIDS. Why it was so obvious that they had AIDS was that their bodies were becoming more and more emaciated. And they had entered that cycle where the body was basically eating itself. And in the process of eating itself, it meant that it was only a matter of months before death would be around the corner. I can even recall the pain of walking from one side of the street to the other side of the street to avoid the possibility that I may become infected. One day, with a group of colleagues in a local church on a particular Sunday, a few of us gathered together and had a conversation, 7 people, and we said, there is something we must do. Does anybody have a clue what we're going to do? And somebody said, that which you are turning our eyes away from, that is what we should go towards. And in unison, all 7 of us said, AIDS. When I went home that day, I realized that I could not look myself in the mirror again and turn my eyes away from AIDS. And so the 7 of us decided that instead of trying to avoid the crisis, we would walk full bore into it. The most obvious thing with these people who were dying of malnutrition is that they needed food. We were 7 people who had virtually no resources, but we just decided, let's go into a church kitchen and start cooking casseroles and walk them into the neighborhood and invite people to actually have a meal. The thing that struck us right from the beginning was, as soon as we started doing this, it was nothing more than just simply feeding the hungry. The actual experience of it was profound because the magnitude of the number of people who needed food was gigantic. And not only that, as we started doing this, the number of people who said, "Can we help?" was equally large. And we were stunningly moved by the realization that others too were just desperate for an opportunity to begin to think about caring for those who were being stigmatized and who were now actually in the process of dying. One could have said, why bother feeding them? They're about to die. But what does that say about us if that we allow the people in our midst who are in the process of dying, we don't care about them? What would it say about us? And it activated such an emotional storm internally that we decided that no matter what, we would go full bore. Nowadays, and I look back, I cringe at that stuff that we prepared. It wasn't food. The stuff that we were preparing was sufficient to glue the sides of their stomach together so that they didn't experience hunger. However, the nutrition that they needed at that time of their illness that would reverse or actually ameliorate the wasting syndrome had not been developed. It didn't take terribly long. With a fair amount of energy, we did figure out the way of producing very small volumes of food that could pack within even just a little brownie or a little cookie, all 22 proteins. And so today we know a lot about the nutritional needs of people who are ill that we had no clue about back then. I want to say a little bit now about the context, and I'll just describe it in the Philadelphia setting because it's the one that's most familiar to me, but I think it's also a good illustration of what was going on basically around the world. In this country, it was decided, erroneously, by the way, it was decided that this was a gay disease. That has got to be one of the most prejudicial things that ever happened. It was never, ever, ever a gay disease. From the very beginning, there were heterosexual people, mums and dads and kids with HIV who were being infected as well. But it was really convenient to be able to say, it's just a problem of the gays. It'll only be circulating in the gay community. We found in the very first week that we started engaging in the building of this organization that became to be referred to as MANA, Metropolitan AIDS Neighborhood Nutrition Alliance is what we called it. The very first week, we were finding people who were whole families who were infected by this virus. So the thing that is so stunning about these viruses is that they don't discriminate. There is no protection. It is a universal phenomenon that all of us ultimately have to wrestle with. So let me tell you a little bit about what that experience was like at the beginning. We realized that probably in a matter of days, that this couldn't just be a little project of 7 people who were walking into a church kitchen and carrying food into the neighborhood. We had to organize. So we began to put together an organization, which was what would be classically in India referred to as civil society organization or NGO. We began to incorporate ourselves and then declared ourselves as open. So we thought the easiest way to begin would be actually go to restaurants. This is beyond when we stopped just cooking on each evening in the church's basement. We decided we would go to restaurants and ask them whether they would be willing to donate meals for those who were suffering from HIV. I recall on the very first occasion when we received a phone call that came from Tony. It was a Thursday, and he, with all the angst of a person who was in decline, said, I think I would love to receive the meals that you're offering. When can they start and so on? And so I went to visit him. Upon meeting him, he had a little kitten in his lap, and that kitten at some stage raced across the floor and jumped into my lap and scratched me on the hand. As I walked out of that place, I said to myself, well, I guess I now have HIV. I didn't know anything about it, but that was the illusion that was being communicated at that stage. So that Friday after Thursday, I said, okay, we'll start delivering meals to you. I spent an afternoon racing around the city on my bicycle, going to restaurants to see who would be willing to donate a meal for Tony. I found plenty of places that seemed congenial about this idea, but I couldn't find any owner. And I'm riding my bike back to the Penn campus with my tail between my legs, and I go past the faculty club and I say, Kenwyn, you fool, the faculty club. Why didn't you go to the faculty club? So I parked my bike and raced in and found Walt, the manager. I'd never met him before. And I started saying to him, basically what I'm saying to you right now. We're trying to provide meals for people living with HIV. They're in the final stages of their life and in decline, and we'd like to be communitarian and take care of them. And he said, I'm in, absolutely. So I went back to my home office and picked up a telephone and started calling friends and neighbors and so on, and to get a volunteer, somebody who delivered on Monday and somebody to deliver on Tuesday and on Wednesday, 5 people. But by the time I'd gone through that, another call had come in. I said, oh, if only I'd asked Walt for 2 meals. So I decided, well, he was very friendly, let me call up. And I called and said, Walt, it's Kenwyn. Any chance you could give 2 meals? He said, yes, definitely. Well, by the time I called Walt that afternoon for the 5th occasion, he said to me, Kenwyn, please don't call again. Haven't you got the message? And I said, what's the message I'm supposed to get? And this is what he said, Kenwyn, whatever you ask of me, I will say yes. Whatever you ask of me, I will say yes. By that next Monday, we were taking 10 meals out of Walt's kitchen, the place that was preparing food for Penn faculty. It was a freight train out of control as we got ourselves launched. Just as an aside, it took me probably a month before I got back to Walt. Raced into his office one day and said, Walt, I'm here to thank you. And he said with a lot of energy, Kenwyn, please do not come here to thank me. I felt like maybe I'd politically offended him, and he said, come in. But I do not want your thanks. I want you to sit here and receive my thanks. Walt, what are you thankful for? He said, let me tell you something. There is nothing that's more demotivating for my chefs than cooking meals for the faculty. They are a demoralized community. I've used every managerial trick in the book, and it's never worked. But the very day I said, we're going to start preparing meals for people dying from HIV-AIDS, the climate in the workplace changed instantaneously. It gave an infusion of meaning to these people, and the place has just become transformed. It's become transformed because now they're doing something or other their hearts are actually connected with. And the faculty and the whole institution is becoming a beneficiary of this. That was a lesson for me that just took deep, deep root. Another brief story. The very first week, we also were delivering into the worst neighborhood in Philadelphia. It was predominantly occupied by the Latinx community. Were young families, a lot of kids around and so on. But it was also the heart of the drug distribution center. And I had, along with these other colleagues, we were all doing this now, I'm just describing my stories here. I had managed to get culturally compatible food for them, and I was walking into the home of this particular neighborhood when drug dealers came from everywhere. It was a period when I had a minivan and still had some booster seats from young children. Children were still young, and they just came from everywhere like flies. I pushed them away and said, please leave. And I went inside. It was a very complicated setting in the families there. I was there for about an hour, half an hour. And as I was walking out, I thought, gee, my car might not even be there. Surprisingly, it was. The next day when I came, there wasn't a whole cadre of drug dealers showing up at all. Just one came across very quietly and very gently. And he put his arms on the top of the van and he said, I want to let you know that we've figured out what you're doing. I'm sure that you probably feel a little anxious about being in a neighborhood where we're all here. But I want to promise you that nobody, but nobody, will mess with your car. We will protect you. What? The drug dealers of the city of Philadelphia are going to take care of somebody like me who's coming into their neighborhood? And the answer was yes. Absolutely yes. That same day, I walked into another household. And this is a story that I often cannot tell without tears emerging. But I walked into this particular neighborhood. It was a very, very hot day. A lot of kids were outside running through the fire hydrants that had been opened. And a woman came to me and she indicated that she was actually the mother of the household I was delivering meals to, a mom and a dad and 2 young children. And she just pointed to the house and said, will you please take the food into the home and put it in the kitchen table? Happy to do so. But as I walked in, there was a small boy. He was about 4 years old. He was propped up with some pillows on a couch. And his head was very large proportional to his body. Actually, his head was quite normal. It was just that his body was completely emaciated. I didn't speak any Spanish. He didn't speak any English. Fernando was his name. But as I walked in, that small boy's eyes and mine caught each other in a gaze. And we held the eye contact for many, many, many seconds. I experienced from him a look of gratitude that I had never seen before. A small boy who actually died about 3 to 4 months later. A small boy who was grateful for a meal. There was also a 3 or 4 month old baby just a room next door. She also died within a few months. But I can tell you that Fernando's look, that expression of gratitude for a good, nutritious meal, has bored into my eyes. It doesn't matter what adversity exists in my life today. I can close my eyes and I can see Fernando's gratitude. I've taken many courses, I've read many books, I've listened to many lectures. I don't think anybody in my life has affected me more than that small boy. That boy who is able to look with gratitude into the eyes of a Caucasian man in my 40s and say, thank you for this food. The whole experience of building Manna was wild. It was, in no time, we had ourselves completely organized. We had to raise money. The 7 of us who were the originators, we were the board of the organization. We were the cooks. We were the cleanup crew. We were the meal distributors. We were the grant writers, the 7 of us. We were the same group doing all these functions. We had to get ourselves organized, and across time, we actually did, and then we had to raise major money. I want to talk a little bit about money, because we had none. We were gifted by that particular church that we began cooking in, $4,000 for the year. The person we hired as the executive director that when we invited her to take over this job, she was one of the 7. She said, exactly how long do you think you could give me some kind of stability? And my response was, I was chair of the board. My response was, well, if there's no crisis, probably 2 or 3 weeks. And she said to me, you mean you want me to give up my job as an executive with the water company and give up the family health care in order for that level of stability? And my response was, yes, that's what it will take. And she just laughed hysterically. And then I said, but that's the good news. She said, what's the bad news? I said, well, we'll probably fail. But if we fail, you'll be blamed. Or we may become successful, in which case we'll grow much beyond your capacities to run it, in which case we'll have to dismiss you. And she said, this is the best job offer that I've ever received. Forget about it, Kenwyn. It's not going to happen. 2 days later, she called and says, I'm in. That story happened over and over and over again. I want to share with you what it was like running a board meeting. Invariably, there'd be a treasurer's report, usually second or third thing on the agenda, and the treasurer would say something like bank balance at the beginning of the month, $486. Expenses for the month, $20,265. Income for the month, $20,892. Balance, whatever is the difference. For 18 months in a row, that was our experience. We had nothing at the beginning of the month, and at the end of the month, we'd paid all the bills. This was just thoroughly mysterious to us. The money came from the most bizarre settings. The gay men's bowling league in leather jackets would have had a fundraiser and come in and give us $3,000. 15 kids from an elementary school, 4th grade, will have cooked some baked some cookies and had a little bake sale and would give us $36.27. The money came from the most mysterious places, but bit by bit by bit, month by month by month, we always had just what we needed, not more and not less. It's really quite humbling to recognize that almost always when we're doing something of importance, we need economic resources. But I can say with no hesitation that in the final analysis, I think the last thing we need to do is in these particular times is to chase the money. I think if we become locked into paying attention to the emotion and the value and the importance of the mission of what we're doing, then the resources show up. I'll give an example about this much, much later. Eventually, our first executive director left and we employed a new executive director. He was very vigorous in his confidence about being able to get the resources and so on. But it did so happen that at the end of that particular year, we looked like his first year. We looked like we were going to be about $35,000 short. Our budget was probably then about $4,000 to $5,000, $100,000. And it wasn't a trivial amount to be short. And he called me and said with a fair degree of disquietness, I'm sorry, Kenwyn, but I think we're going to be short this particular month. I came here confident that I'd be able to give us economic stability, but I'm sorry. And my response was, don't sweat it, buddy. It'll all work out. 2 days later, he called and he said, Kenwyn, I've just had the most bizarre experience. What's that? He said, somebody just walked in off the street, a lawyer for somebody or other who'd just died. And he said that he had been instructed by the deceased to make sure that the money was given to an AIDS organization. And I decided that it would be manna. And so I'm come to write a check for you. And John assumed he's going to perhaps write a check for $500 or $1,000. And so he says, so how much would you like to give? And he said, $35,000. Years later, we needed to expand and build a proper kitchen and so on and so on and so on, and we had to raise some major capital. It seemed like about $1 million was going to be necessary, and our budget was still, annual budget was still less than $1 million. So if you run a capital campaign for $1 million, you may be able to get that money, but then you have a reduction in the operating donations the next year. So this was a little bit precarious. And so we made the decision that we'd try and get a couple of major funders. There were two in particular that I went after. One of them I knew was certain was going to give us $200,000. And there was another organization I'd been actually working with and had helped form an actually organizational foundation. And I felt convinced that when I asked, Terry Larson was his name, asked Terry, the CEO, for money, I was absolutely convinced he would give us $200,000. And when I made the ask, he said, I'm terribly sorry, Ken. We just gave away $200,000 to somebody else who's doing work with AIDS. And actually it was to somebody other who's on your board. So you've just come a week or two late. Our hearts sunk a little bit and said, okay, so be it. We move on. Let's find another outlet. But nobody seemed to be responding favorably when suddenly a call came from the most bizarre organization. John, the same executive director, called to say, Kenwyn, have you ever heard of the Roth Foundation? Nope. Who's the Roth Foundation? Well, they're an outfit in Wyoming. I've never heard of them. And he said, I just got this call from them, and they said that they would like to make a contribution to MANA. And I asked how much. No, it's a foundation. I thought it was going to be more than a few $100s, but I didn't know how much it was going to be. And maybe $5,000 or $10,000, that would have been great. And they said, we'd like to give you $200,000. And John said, how on earth do you happen to know that we need $200,000? And this is what they said. Oh, we've been watching MANA. We've been watching MANA for the last 3 or 4 years. We knew that the day would come we'd make a major contribution to you. We also knew that that bank that you'd been trying to get money out of had declined. So we decided this was the moment we'd give you that $200,000. That was our experience through the whole of MANA. Believe it or not, we did actually come to the stage where we managed to learn about the appropriate nutritional needs required for people who were living with and dying of AIDS. Many people needed high caloric on this day, high protein on another day, liquids on this occasion. And so we got to the stage where we were having 40 different meal variants every single day, and we were creating hundreds of meals every day. To make it even more problematic, we would have a meal count about 4 o'clock on an evening, and about 40% of those would have changed overnight because of the person's illness. We had connections with the medical systems who would call and say, look, so-and-so is now suffering from this, so you need to change the diet and so on. So we're having to make always, every day was a kind of a crisis around how to actually deal with providing the necessary food. The point I want to make about this is that in the midst of all of this, the assembly of people who became volunteers was completely volunteer-run organization. We had a few employees, like a chef, an executive director, and so on. We had 1,000 volunteers working a week, every week. And the volunteers were just spectacular. The thing that we decided to do was to make sure that we didn't overtax anybody. And so we made little bite-sized chunks. Can you give a couple of hours to help cut carrots and so on? Could you take a couple of hours to actually go and deliver meals? So we approached this entirely through the perspective of volunteer labor. when we did get to the stage of being able to provide these highly tailored nutritional meals to the condition, the medical condition of the person, that actually it was possible to reverse the wasting syndrome. I can to this day remember one of the people who we provided meals for in the late 1980s, who was probably only 6 months to a year away from dying, after the wasting syndrome was actually counteracted. He lived for more than another decade. He actually served on the Manners board and so on. There was no medications, no ameliorative pharmaceuticals available for more than a decade. And it was only really in the 2000s when the protease inhibitors emerged on the scene was there any way of treating HIV. So this was what we were living with day in, day out. One of the things I and virtually everybody else discovered also was the fact that we were with the dying all the time. Every few days, well, usually daily, there'd be somebody who would die. And there was a huge amount of grief. But the thing that became clear to us is that grief is not a debilitating emotion. You can do an incredible number of things while you're grieving at the same time. So if somebody walked back into the kitchen having come from delivering a meal to somebody that had been and doing so for weeks, and that person had just died and would be weeping, the response would be an arm around the shoulder and a bag of carrots and say, please cut. You can cut a lot of carrots while you weep. I'm now a fairly old man, and I've been around a lot of death in my life. But one of the things that I know about grief is this, that grief is the portal to the part of our beings that has never been touched by love. Grief is a portal to the parts of the self that have never been touched by love. And in the final analysis, the only gift that is valuable is the gift that comes from the loving heart. It doesn't matter if it's that $36.42 from fourth graders or $10 from somebody or other who really had nothing. It isn't the amount that matters. It's the quality of the heart that is behind the gift that matters. And this is something or other that is in the human being. We may not completely know it. We may not even understand it. But if we don't have enough love in our life, that we feel half empty, the only thing to do is give away the love we have. Because if we can give that away, lo and behold, that releases the valve springs of the deep, deep waters of love that are in us. If we always want to be full of love, like have a full bank account balance, so plenty to actually spend, therefore we go and spend, it doesn't work like that. That isn't the dynamic of loving. Loving is a process that as you give love away, and I don't mean romantic love, I mean love at the level of the soul, as you give that away, it gets restored. A couple of comments about economics, and then I'll pause and receive questions. Humanity has never, ever, ever, ever been economically wealthier than it is today. Unbelievable wealth. However, we don't have enough for everybody. And that's nothing short of bizarre. The problem isn't whether we've got enough wealth. The problem is, do we know how to distribute it. And in reality, there are only 4 wealth distribution systems that exist: jobs, government, as in government projects, welfare, and crime. They're the 4 biggies. There's also philanthropy, but that's just like a pimple on the back of an elephant. These 4 are systematically shrinking. Jobs going down, nobody wants bigger government, people not particularly keen on welfare, and nobody wants more crime. The challenge of the era in terms of economics is not whether we can make enough money, it's going to be whether we can learn to distribute the money. And this next generation has to wrestle with the question of brand new wealth distribution systems. We also need to recognize that wealth is not something, economic wealth is not something that has any meaning separate from the other wealths upon which it rests. I'm going to just read to you very quickly a list of wealths which a group of international executives created in a program I ran, goodness, probably 20 years ago, when we were saying, look, economic wealth by itself is meaningless. What are the other wealths that exist at the same time which it rests upon? And this is the list they came up with. This is not my list. I'm going to read it to you. These, and this is the order they created. First of all, there's emotional wealth. There is distributional wealth. There is ethical wealth. There is relational wealth, leadership wealth, identity wealth, physical health wealth, intellectual wealth, informational wealth, social wealth, the wealth of influence, wealth of amicability, green or environmental wealth. And then you have financial wealth. All of those things are necessary in order to have economic wealth. Separate from those being existence, the money is thoroughly meaningless. Money can go from being highly valuable to useless. There's no point in having money if there ain't no food that you can even buy. And so I want to just leave you with this particular thought, and then we pause for questions, that goes something like this. We are in a time when all of humanity, every single one of us, has the opportunity to learn some new things. I learned so much from the experience of about 10 years of working with the HIV community. I would say, and I wrote a book about it, I'd be happy to share that with you. It's called Manna in the Wilderness of AIDS, 10 Lessons in Abundance. I can say without any embarrassment that if I were to stack up all the things that I learned from courses I did, degrees, lectures I attended, and so on, it might stand as high as this desk I've got in front of me. But if I take the lessons I learned for life about working with HIV/AIDS, it would stand as high as the ceiling. I would trade all of this for that. I would place much higher priority in my own life on the things I learned from the HIV/AIDS community than I would upon my formal education and my whole academic career. That's a pretty wild thing for a person to say, but it is my personal truth. That opportunity exists for all of humanity right now. I wonder if we'll be courageous enough to actually seize it and engage in the transformation that every single one of us know in our bones is absolutely necessary. With that, let me pause and invite questions.
Thank you so much, Kenwyn. Very, very powerful messages indeed. And I think to begin with, I'll just, some of the stories that you shared early on were very emblematic of, how you tapped into graciousness, compassion, our inherent desire as people to create a difference, to be helpful, to contribute in your journey with men. What we're seeing currently is that A lot of it is very evident in our communities. There are many people trying to do some amazing work on the ground. But unfortunately, there's also this other side, which is that of stigma and discrimination. At least in the Indian context, some of what we've seen, and I presume that a lot of it stems from fear, but a lot of what we've been seeing alongside is, let's say, stigma against people who are working on the ground, because people are scared that, let's say a healthcare worker or anybody in the essential services coming back could be contagious. Or the fact that certain communities had mass gatherings right at the beginning of the pandemic and have been seen as, the term I believe is super spreaders. And hence the larger communities have ended up being discriminated on religious grounds and so on. How do we tackle this? How do we move it back to, our ability to love, care, and be compassionate?
Well, I think the only way to start with that is to start with ourselves. And the reality is that we are all anxious. I'm anxious. Every one of us is anxious for good reason. I could get the virus and die. I could be dead in 2 weeks' time. That's a completely rational emotion. But anxiety is not an alien force. And anxiety is just part of our being. Most of us want to try to get rid of anxiety. We can't get rid of anxiety. We get a pill or ask for some kind of palliative that will, if only we accept that anxiety can be our closest ally, that there's no reason not to be anxious. Goodness, even getting on an event like this today is anxiety producing for me, but it's so familiar, it's just what it is. And I think that a little bit like with when you activate the resources that are in our hearts, anxiety is just there. We human beings have come to believe that we're entitled to not feel vulnerable. But life is vulnerable. Everything about life is vulnerable. But if we could accept that vulnerability is always with us, we wouldn't then have to turn around and then generate fears that are concrete, that now I know what I'm afraid of. If I'm going in the dark, here's a good example of it. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, reported on having a dream, and this was his dream. He was in the moorlands, it was dark, and he couldn't see. And he was afraid that maybe there was something behind him, but he couldn't see if there was. So he lit a candle. And now that he lit a candle, he noticed that there was a breeze. So he kept his hand around the candle, and now he could see what he was afraid of. Behind him was a shadow. So he began to run. And as he ran, the wind threatened to blow the candle out more, so he cupped his hands tighter, and the shadow grew larger. We all take our amorphous anxiety and try to generate them into fears. And the moment then we're afraid, we can find an adversary who is responsible for making us feel afraid. Nobody makes me feel afraid. Nobody makes me feel anything. I am the source of my feelings, not others. They're just being whoever they are. And so if perchance we're walking across the street and we're afraid of somebody or other and we stigmatize them, we have actually denigrated ourselves in that moment. We have so otherized them that we've otherized ourselves. And the moment we've otherized ourselves, they will feel otherized by us, and that ping pong game just proceeds. Every single one of us has the capacity to live with our anxieties, not translate them into fears. And I would say that every time you feel even that sense of, gee, that particular person is an other, we can turn around and sort of say, they are just like me. They are my brother or my sister. And if they need a hug, I will give it to them. If not physically, at least emotionally, I can do that. And I think we learn to dislike people. But one of the things that our higher selves know is that we got to be willing to love even the people that we don't like. We got to be able to love the people that do things that we don't like. That's on us. So I think we have to start with just ourselves. And ironically, I'm going to use this term, that when we begin to behave that way, it's contagious. When we start behaving that way with each other. We can't produce social policies that'll do that. I think that starts with the hearts. I don't know how many people are on here today, but if it's 100 people, boy, that 100 people in a day's time could be 500 people. And in a month's time could be 10,000 people.
Yeah. Somewhat connected with this, I also wanted to touch upon the fact that one of the most difficult things in this pandemic has been how it's laid bare, social structures that are oppressive, that we've been trying to battle for ages now. And the virus itself has, while it does not discriminate in terms of how contagious it is, it's definitely had more detrimental effects on communities that are underserved, marginalized, either because of caste, class, or race across continents and countries. How do we process that? And do you think there's an opportunity for some enduring change, disproportionate change to happen right now compared to how it's been?
I would like to be forgiven, if you don't mind, for not prognosticating on trying to produce a solution to the world's biggest problem for a few thousand years. I think it's a little too early for us to know exactly what's on the horizon.
Right.
But there are plenty of cases in history where we've seen this be played out. The avian flu of 1918, 1919, 1920, 30 to 50 million people died from that. That's massive. Look at the number of people we're talking about here, 2 million. That's a drop in the bucket. That is minuscule, absolutely minuscule, in contrast with the past. So at least at the public health level, worldwide at present, we're doing extraordinarily well. I mean, there are problems. Yes, there are problems. And we probably will have 2 million. I think if we get away with 10 million, we could view ourselves as a blessed people. But the world right at the present is collaborating. It may be hard for the United States to get the Chinese to send us testing kits just because of geopolitics. But in my homeland, they just sent 10 million to Australia, only 25 million people there. There is sharing going on that. I actually have friends and people in China say, hey, tell me, who do I send masks to? So I think that there is an amazing quality of collaboration taking across the world at the moment. And flowing out of the epidemic of the 1918 and then into the Great Depression. We may be coming up to a main depression, who knows? The emergence of Nazism, that tumbles into wars. We're not having wars at the moment. So I think it's worth at least celebrating that this is a period when we have the whole world simultaneously equally vulnerable, struggling with their own internal issues in their nations. But there isn't a magic switch to that. You know that. But, as I just said before, we all know the character and quality of our own hearts. And if we just behave congruently with those things, that's at least the starting point in our own backyard. And you can't deal with other people's backyard until you've dealt with our own backyard. But the bigger issues are for another day. I am writing a book about it, by the way. I started writing a brand new book, which I never imagined writing. So maybe in a few months' time, I'll have something to say about that.
We'll be on the lookout for that. Great. So moving on, you were talking about wealth distribution earlier. And of course, you talked about wealth in its various forms. But just sticking to the economics question about distribution, would you say that the current system has failed us? And if so, what would be an effective way of achieving equitable distribution, according to you?
Well, I actually think the core principles of economics are flawed. The majority of metrics with respect to economics are based upon the notion of hoarding. If you got a lot of money in the bank, you're wealthy. I actually don't think that's true. You may be economically wealthy, but you may not be wealthy in other ways. So many people say we need this money for the rainy day. Today's the rainy day. So isn't this the time we ought to be giving the money? So for people that got a spare $1 million in the bank, why aren't we giving it? Or if we've got spare food in the refrigerator and somebody on the street is hungry, why aren't we giving it? So I think that the tendency to say we've got to hoard for the occasions, blah, blah, blah. But the issue with wealth inequity is that if you think about economics, its beauty is it can be basically the bloodstream of the world. But if you have the bloodstream that only services your head and the right-hand side of your body, and it doesn't go to the left-hand side of your body doesn't function. So it's actually, I think, the flow of the money, it's the flowing that is the major metric. We don't measure that. Well, some people do, but we generally don't. If we go to this return on investments, return on economic investment, but what about those other sets of investments I was reading off to you here? What about the emotional investment? What about the intellectual wealth? I mean, return on investment, the massive sets of investments which don't get into our metrics. I think all of economics has to be transformed. If you want to put your foot on a gas pedal, I think that's one of the ones we could well go towards. But that too is more than a 2-minute conversation.
Sure.
If anybody's interested in this, there's more about it I've written a book that's readily available on the web, abundancescarcity.com. And I call it the abundance scarcity paradox. That's the title of the book, abundancescarcity.com. It's freely available.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kenwyn. I'll take one last question because we're quite close to time now. But, while we are talking about giving, there's also the question of receiving. And one interesting thread that's come up even in some of our past conversations has been about the dignity of the receiver as well. And, there have been instances where people have felt that help which was...
Let me interrupt because I can jump in. I think it takes as much loving to be willing to receive as it is to give. And ironically, you have to be loving enough to be receptive for it to make a gift, because if I'm not prepared to receive it. So I think the place to go with respect to that is to ask yourself the question, are you coming from a loving place? And if somebody gives me a gift and I don't want it, and I'm not loving, well, let's let them keep it. What the heck? But if and anyway, it's not the material thing. Isn't what we want is the capacity to mutually care for each other? Don't we want to be able to give our love and receive our love? Isn't that what humanity is about? I know you're about to end, so I want to just read you a story. I'm going to last a page out of this book, and it's the way I'd like to finish here today.
Yes, please.
So, it's available. The name of the book is Manna in the Wilderness of AIDS, 10 Lessons in Abundance. But this is what I want to read to you. In our early days, manna's biggest anguish was its hand-to-mouth existence. For years, we hovered on a precarious edge, forced to focus solely on the present. We could not afford more than a moment to celebrate any achievement because there were always another few hundred hungry people needing to be fed. We had to stay focused on today and let tomorrow take care of itself. If we were too concerned about the future, today would be lost, and then tomorrow would be irrelevant. We never planned to build an organization based on a moment by moment, day by day, week by week ethos. It just happened. The many attempts we made to get beyond this only gave us enough slack to deal with the crisis just around the corner. None of us liked this, but it was our reality. For manna to stay alive every today required as much commitment as yesterday, which proved to be a blessing. In a strange way, there was a kind of parallelism between our organization and each person living with AIDS. The same precariousness, the same uncertainty about what each day might bring, the same anxiety about how long life as we knew it might last, provided a bond between manna and its clients, keeping us in harmony with the daily reality of those we served. It also seemed that by some process we never fully grasped, manna managed to touch something tucked away in the core of each of us, a hunger for faith. If, as Tillich says, faith is only possible in the midst of doubt and ceases to be viable when standing on the rock of certitude, then could it be that the depth of our doubt made us open to the faith of the ages? Certainly AIDS shoved us all into the void where doubt and uncertainty resided. There, in the place where hopelessness was total, we gave up even hoping and became exposed to our raw hunger for faith. That craving built and built until in the midst of total absurdity, we just ended up jumping. Why did we take the plunge? Because we couldn't think of anything else to do. We were at the end of our rope. Rationality had deserted us. But it was that leap which released the ever-flowing springs in the bottom of the wells of our despair. And when we went through the door and looked at the world with differently calibrated eyes, we saw that the whole landscape was covered with manna, was covered with abundance. In the face of our own impoverishment, in the fullness of our limitations, we found the abundance that gives life to life. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Kenwyn. That was a lovely, lovely note to end on. We're truly grateful for your time and the message that you've shared with so much love. It's been received with love also, I assure you. For those of you that joined us tonight, thank you so much for your time.